Today in the EU, the European Investment Bank is looking into relaxing lending criteria for military investments. The European Investment Bank is poised to loosen lending criteria, potentially lifting restrictions on financing ammunition and weapons production. But who is pushing for it, and what will be the implications of loosening these criteria? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. We invited Anna Brunetti, Euractiv's economy editor, to break down this very complex topic. Anna, this is indeed something very difficult to digest for us. Can you help us understand it better? What are we talking about today?
Just to clarify the context we're talking about, we're in the third year now of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine from Russia, started in February 2022. That means that we've seen growing momentum among EU legislators and politicians to step up the bloc's defense industry and strategy, obviously heightened by this aggravating geopolitical situation in Ukraine and Russia. With the EU looking for new ways to increase funding into defense, but also to ramp up its military industrial capacity.
And on a policy side, what does this signify?
This has kind of translated into some shifts that have seen broadened support for an expanded role of the European Investment Bank into defense investment. So basically what happened was that EU leaders have put the issue on the table in spring 2022, but most recently in 2023, last year, it was defense ministers starting to ramp up calls for the EIB to take on an expanded role in funding defense assets.
Right, but what is at stake?
So far, the EIB has only invested into dual-use technologies and projects, which means that the civilian part of the investment needs to have the largest slice of the project themselves. So basically, that means that the EIB mandate is to mainly invest in research and development or infrastructure and technology that has mostly a civilian utilization. The military part it's supposed to be, let's say, the minority stake in these projects.
Okay, so what is happening in this case then?
Defense minister have followed EU leaders in calling for a review of this definition of dual use to allow for the military use to be enlarged and stretched within dual use. So that will mean that the EIB would then be able to invest in projects and technologies and production that is mostly devoted to the military use, but that would allow for many more assets to be included in the EIB investment scope.
Just to understand this a little bit better, because you are mentioning the dual-use projects and some excluded activities, what are these exactly?
That can include a lot of things. It can be anything from cybersecurity to satellite technology to equipment that can be used for different either defense or security purposes. So far, the list of exclusion within the EIB mandate makes it really clear that what cannot be included in the kind of accessible criteria for dual use is anything that can have a lethal impact. So ammunition and weapons will be the most straightforward technologies and products that we can list in that category.
And why is so important? What does this change mean in practice?
So what we're talking about is the fact that the EIB is the EU lending arm, and it was originated mainly as a development bank. So the way it's been built through the years and the way it's been invested in by private markets as well is a development bank, which means that its main remit and mandate was to invest in development of the single market, especially in regions and areas that were economically struggling or in need of more funding. Its remit is really that of a development bank, in line, for example, with the very similar to the EBRD, which is the other EU development bank, but also with the World Bank. So really, we can think of like the most non-multilateral investment banks, public banks that are really devoted mostly to development purposes. Its second area that has actually become really probably the focus, and will remain its focus going forward, is that it's now seen as a climate bank, is the EU climate bank. So one of the main goals is for it to sustain and support the transition towards, greener energy systems.
So who is responsible for this then?
So after we've seen for 2 years that EU leaders and defense ministries have kind of taken up calls from the defense industry itself to really allow for more public investment into defense assets, the call has now been moved on to the table of finance ministers. And this happened in February at the informal ECOFIN in Ghent. Ahead of that meeting, defense ministers had written a letter calling and urging on their financial sector counterparts to take on that discussion and to really assess practical ways to call on the EIB to expand its remit of dual use and to review and reconsider the definition of dual use. That kind of changes the focus of the debate as well, because we're going from an industry and a policy area that finds it a very logical debate to be talking about expanding investment into defense assets onto an area where that topic itself is much more, let's say, problematic.
Problematic in what way?
It's not immediate for financial markets and for financial institutions to be looking at defense assets and as something as straightforward and logical as defense industry and defense minister will look at. Defense assets from the point of view of financial markets are seen as slightly riskier and something that not necessarily all institutional investors want to pivot into. Specifically, I'm thinking about pension funds and even asset managers which have like an investment remit that is strictly bound by conservative investment criteria, which would be steering clear of more risky assets. That could be quite a big shift for them to then continue investing into the EIB when the EIB remit is changed to allow for that direct investment.
Now, all eyes are on the Council about this. What can we expect next?
The Parliament and now also the Commission have basically corroborated their support for this mandate of the EIB to reconsider its dual-use definition. So the third legislator, the Council, is now under the spotlight because if the EIB gets the 3 legislators to call for that revision, then it has to put forward a proposal. The EIB is basically composed by, its board of governors are the 27 finance ministers. It is effectively following the instructions of EU legislators and policymakers and ministers. In that sense, it will have to put forward a concrete proposal detailing how its remit could be changed and amended.
You wrote about the 3 possible different scenarios to actually get it done. Can you explain to us what are the options on the table?
So now the most conservative option on the table will be to, let's say, stretch and revise its dual-use definition, again, to allow for the balance between civilian and military use to be shifted towards the military side of things. And that would be the easiest option on the table because it wouldn't require a change of the exclusion list, for example. So it wouldn't have to go into changing the list of excluded activity, mainly would be ammunition and weapons. If that is not enough and there's an appetite for a broader expansion and revision, then the second option is to go beyond dual use. That means that the EIB is no longer bound to only invest in dual use technologies or projects, but it can go into military assets. We could consider them defensive military assets, which means, again, that they steer clear of anything that has a lethal impact. So that could be equipment, critical infrastructure, but that could involve many, many more assets that are more direct investment into defense. The third option, obviously, is the more extreme options, which will mean that the EIB actually goes into ammunition, artillery, and weapons. That is probably the least sustainable one.
And who is pushing for lifting these restrictions?
It's something that only now is reaching the financial sector per se. It originated from the defense sector and from defense ministries and EU leaders as well. And again, it's been highly conditioned by the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. For financial markets, it's a completely different debate, and it will be quite interesting to see how these two spheres are going to interact. The main strength of the EIB from the point of view of financial markets, it's its AAA rating. So what happens is that the EIB can have a preferential access to financial markets and access to very convenient borrowing terms.
Sorry, what is a AAA rating?
Any financial asset is, let's say, labeled through credit ratings. These are granted by rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, Fitch. These are the three main global rating agencies. There are lots of defined criteria to grant these ratings. The main one that comes to mind is the possibility of default of a borrower. In the case of the EIB, because obviously it's a public bank backed by the 27 member states, there's a lot of public guarantee in there that makes it really, really, really solid from the investor's perspective. However, the credit default risk is just one. It is a very vital part, but it's just one. So many investors could argue that they're going to look at other aspects as well that are part of defining the AAA. One of the things that is really important for investors is the predictability and transparency of their investment so that they can monitor their investment through time. Direct defense assets are less transparent than others because for the definition of military purpose itself, there is not as much long-term visibility into these projects and time because of the purpose itself. They're not going to be as transparent.
I remember during the financial crisis of 2008 and then in 2012, these ratings were mentioned everywhere on the news. Unfortunately, I was quite young back then to really understand why they were so important. So
if you talk to people in support of the shift of the EIB, they would argue that the AAA is only defined by credit risk. But actually, what needs to be reminded here is that credit rating agencies themselves have come under a lot of pressure, huge amount of pressure after the financial crisis, because the crisis itself was triggered by assets that were rated AAA sometimes. So we're talking about securitized assets. Some of these assets had a AAA rating, and these ones were precisely those that triggered the financial crisis.
And you have had the chance to speak to relevant sources on this. Can you share a bit more about what they had to say?
There's clearly a shift from even a few months ago in terms of what the EIB is willing to consider and I guess kind of taking on that pressure and really getting to explore the possible option it has on the table to work on its mandate. But we've seen it quite publicly from Nadia Calvino, the president of the EIB. She has publicly confirmed that the bank is in conversation with the Commission and with relevant stakeholder, and it will report back in 2 months. This was in February, so that means that by mid to end of April, we might have more concrete options on the table from the EIB itself. However, from the other side of things, when we're thinking about, again, financial sector, but also relevant associations that have been monitoring the EIB closely as a very relevant multilateral public bank, one of the most important in the world, there are ongoing concerns.
What was the main concern?
How this could affect the situation and the risk profile of the EIB. In general, I guess like one of the main concern was that this shift could mean that the EIB credibility as a development bank is slightly hindered and put at stake.
Is there a point where both the financial sector and the EU legislators meet?
A relevant point that is actually equally relevant for both the financial sector side and EU legislators is that where this consideration becomes a problem is that nobody, no country will want to put at stake the AAA rating of the EIB. We have talked to sources that have confirmed that both, for example, from the Italian side and the German side, there is a lot of emphasis put on the AAA rating. So despite the fact that these two countries were among those that were calling for this shift and for reconsidering the EIB dual-use discussion and remit, the same two countries are really, really protective of that status of AAA. So it will really be about investigating and assessing what could possibly happen to the AAA rating, because that appears to be one of the crux of the matter.
Thank you, Anna, for breaking this down for us. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sanz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.